The lantern in the fog in the coastal town of Fog Harbor, Maine, where the Atlantic crashed against jagged cliffs and fog rolled in like a living thing, lived David and Natalie Hart. David, 44, was a gruff fisherman who knew the tides like his own heartbeat. Natalie, 41, owned a quaint bookstore on Main Street, her gentle voice a comfort to locals. They'd been married 18 years, their life weathered but steady. No kids, just a cat named Storm and a weathered cottage by the sea. But beneath the rhythm of their days, a storm was brewing, one that would unravel everything. Prologue. A flicker in the night, it started with a light. One stormy October night, David woke to an empty bed. Natalie's side was cold. He glanced out the window and saw a faint glow, a lantern swaying in the fog, moving toward the cliffs. He waited, assuming she'd gone for air, but she didn't return until dawn, soaked and shivering. Couldn't sleep, she muttered, avoiding his eyes. David noticed her boots caked with sand from the beach below, a place she rarely went. The next morning, he found a damp note in her coat pocket. "Meet me at the cove." Midnight. The handwriting wasn't hers. David's gut twisted, but he said nothing. He'd weathered storms before. This one he'd face head on. Chapter 1. The Midnight Shadow. A week later, Natalie said she was closing the bookstore late for inventory. She kissed him goodbye and left at 7 p.m. By 11, David's unease grew. He grabbed his binoculars and headed to the cliffs overlooking Harper's Cove, a rocky inlet fisherman avoided. In the fog, he saw her, Natalie, standing by the water with a man. Tall, lean, with a fisherman's cap pulled low, he held a lantern. They spoke briefly, then he handed her a small package. She slipped it into her bag and hurried away. David didn't follow. He drove home, replaying the scene. Was this an affair, or something darker? Natalie returned at 1 a.m., claiming a shelf collapsed at the store. Her hands trembled as she poured tea. David watched silently, planning his next move. Chapter 2. The Man in the Cap. The next day, David asked around the docks about a tall man with a lantern. Old Jim, a retired skipper, nodded. "That's Luke Tanner. Came back to town 6 months ago. Keeps to himself. Lives in that shack by the cove. Rough past. Jail time, I hear." David remembered Luke, a quiet kid from Natalie's high school days, always sketching by the shore. She'd mentioned him once, years ago, then never again. He checked the town records. Luke Tanner, 43, had served 5 years for smuggling in the 90s. Released a decade ago, he'd vanished until now. No ties to Natalie on paper, but David's mind churned. He needed proof. Chapter 3. The locked drawer. David started watching Natalie closer. She grew secretive, locking her phone, taking calls outside, leaving the house at odd hours. One afternoon, while she was at the bookstore, he searched her desk. In a locked drawer, key hidden under a loose floorboard, he found a bundle of letters yellowed with age. They were from Luke, written in prison. "You promised we'd run away. Don't forget me, Nat." The last one, dated 6 months ago, read, "I'm back. We finish what we started." Below the letters, a bank statement showing $60,000 withdrawn from their savings over 3 months, cash transfers she'd never mentioned. David's hands shook. Was she funding an escape? Or something worse? He called his sister, Ellen, a paralegal in Portland. She arrived the next day, sharp-eyed and no-nonsense. "I'll dig into Tanner," she said. "But you're in deep, Dave. Be ready for ugly." Chapter 4. The fourth player. Ellen's research uncovered more. Luke wasn't alone, 2 others were involved. A woman, mid-40s, with a shaved head and tattoos, had been seen with him at the cove. Her name was Marla Kane, a former smuggler turned loan shark. The second was a man in a black hoodie, identity unknown, spotted watching Natalie's bookstore. Ellen got a photo of Marla from a contact, hard face, cold eyes. "She's dangerous," Ellen warned. "If Nat's tied to her, it's not just love." David planted a recorder in Natalie's bag. The next night, it caught a conversation at the cove. Luke's voice tense. "Marla's on edge." "We need the boat ready by next week," Natalie whispered. "I've got half the cash." David's suspicious. He's asking about the money. Marla cut in, icy. "Handle him or I will." David's stomach dropped. He was a target. Chapter 5. The wreckage below David and Ellen mapped the cove's cliffs, finding a hidden cave beneath. Inside, crates of cash, maps of coastal routes, and a rusted boat tucked under a tarp. Photos pinned to the wall showed Natalie and Luke from decades ago, alongside recent shots of David fishing. Someone had been watching him too. A logbook listed shipments, drugs, likely, totaling $200,000. One entry read, "Nat's cut, 50K final run, then we're gone." David realized Natalie wasn't just cheating. She was part of a smuggling ring, using their savings to bankroll it. But why? He remembered her father, a fisherman who drowned under shady circumstances. Had Luke pulled her into his world back then? Chapter 6. The lantern's glow. David confronted Natalie at home, the recorder and letters on the table. She collapsed, tears streaming. "Luke's my past," she sobbed. "We were kids planning to sail away. After Dad died, he got me into smuggling, small stuff. I quit when I met you, but he found me last year. Marla's his boss now. They forced me back in. The money's to pay them off, David." "I swear." He pressed harder. She admitted Luke had evidence, photos of her from the 90s unloading contraband. Marla threatened to frame her unless she helped with one last job, a drug run up the coast. David didn't buy her victim act. He called Ellen. "We shut this down." Chapter 7. The trap in the fog. David and Ellen devised a plan. They tipped off the Coast Guard anonymously, claiming a smuggling boat would leave Harper's Cove at midnight. David leaked a fake meet time to Marla through Natalie's phone, ensuring she'd show. That night, fog thick, he watched from the cliffs as Luke, Marla, and the hoodie man loaded the boat. Natalie stayed ashore, per their deal. The guards swooped in, lights blazing, sirens cutting the haze. Marla fired at them, hitting a deputy before being tackled. Luke tried to flee but was caught in the shallows. The hoodie man vanished into the fog. Police found $150,000 in cash and drugs in the boat, enough to bury them all. Chapter 8. The fallout. Natalie faced trial. She testified against Luke and Marla, claiming coercion, and got 3 years probation. The hoodie man, later ID'd as Marla's brother, escaped, a loose end that haunted David. He sold the cottage, took Storm, and moved to a cabin in Vermont, cutting ties with Natalie for good. Epilogue. A dimming light. Fog Harbor carried on, its cliffs silent once more. David walked Vermont's snowy trails, Storm at his heels, the lantern's glow a fading memory. Natalie sent a letter from probation, pleading for a second chance. He tossed it in the fire. Some promises he knew were meant to drown in the tide.